So we've talked about people flocking to the cities because of the enclosure movement looking for work, but what we haven't discussed yet is what was life like for them in these cities? Well, not exactly stellar. Industrialization brought the rapid growth of towns and developments such as the greater area of London. Um, the people who were wealthier lived in beautiful homes. Um, there were churches, there were public buildings, great, beautiful town centers. We're talking fountains, shops, cafes. The poor crowded into cheap, shoddy row houses. And these are not the type of houses where it's a townhome, it's a row house, and they have the entire house to themselves. This is a situation where within these row homes there might be 7 rooms, and you might have 7 families living in one house. 1 room per family, as you can see in the picture right here. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So 5 kids, 2 adults living in a 1 room house. Sudden population growth, crowding, and a lack of municipal services made urban problems more serious than they had ever been in the past because you have inadequate facilities for sewage disposal, air and water pollution, and diseases made urban life unhealthy and also contributed to a high infant mortality and a short life expectancy. Reports of the horrors of slum life led to municipal reforms that began to alleviate the ills of urban life after the mid 19th century. Just to give you an idea of how polluted some of these areas were, there were people who were being diagnosed with rickets. We'll get into that a bit more as to what rickets actually is because A, the pollution blotted out the sunlight in certain areas, and B, because people were inside working at factory jobs all day and could not go outside. And this is actually what rickets looks like. It's the bending of the bones, generally from a vitamin D deficiency. In the rural environment, almost all land in Europe had been transformed by human activity before the Industrial Revolution. Americans transformed their environment even faster than Europeans did, clearing land, using it until the soil was depleted, and then moving on. Industrialization relieved pressure on the English environment in some ways. Agricultural raw materials were replaced by industrial materials or imports, while the use of coal and the availability of cheap iron reduced the demand for wood. Working conditions, guys, were awful for the majority of people. Industrialization offered new, highly paid opportunities for a small number of skilled carpenters, metal workers, machinists. Most industrial jobs were unskilled, repetitive, boring, badly paid, and came with incredibly poor working conditions. Lack of fresh air, lack of proper light, proper ventilation, breaks, short working shifts. 8 hours is kind of a long shift, 14 is a lot longer. The separation of work from home had a major impact on women and on family life. Women workers were concentrated in textile mills and they earned much less than men. Husband and wives worked in separate places. Most of the female workforce consisted of young women who took low paid jobs as domestic servants. Poverty and employers' preference for child workers also led to high rates of child labor. In America, the first industrialists offered good wages and decent working conditions to their women workers. But harsh working conditions, long hours, and low pay soon became standard, and protests by American women led to factory owners to replace them with immigrant women, mostly from Ireland, because they were willing to accept lower pay and worse conditions. The Industrial Revolution increased the demand for cotton, sugar, and coffee, like I've already said, but in doing so, industrialization helped to prolong slavery in the US and the Caribbean and to extend slavery to the coffee growing regions of Brazil. So even though the coffee industry increases the goods for trading, the incredibly negative side to that is it does make the lives worse for enslaved individuals. Changes in society. Industrialization increased disparities in income. The wages and standards of living of the workers varied with the fluctuations of the business cycle, but overall, workers' standards of living did not improve until the 1850s. The real beneficiaries of the Industrial Revolution were the middle class because rising income allowed the middle class to build their own businesses, It allowed women to stay at home, to take care of the children, and to teach them. And it also gave the middle class a higher developed sense of moral responsibility and sensibility that mingled with condemnation and concern when faced with social problems like drunkenness and prostitution in the new industrial cities that stood in contrast to the squalor, well, considered squalor and drunkenness of the working class. So this is where you do have the middle class becoming activists, if you will, and what they see as problems within different parts of the city. And the diagram here is what life is like based on what social class you're in. So you have nice little lounge, wealthier area, nice fun parties, smaller apartments. But then you also see people living in the attic with entire families, very cold or very hot, depending on the time of year. Laissez-faire. You have new economic and political ideas coming with the Industrial Revolution, and laissez-faire is one of them. Adam Smith was the most famous proponent of the laissez-faire doctrine, that government should refrain from interfering in business. Thomas Malthus and David Ricardo argued that the poverty of the working class was the result of overpopulation and that it could best be addressed not by government action, but by delayed marriage and sexual restraint to limit the number of children being born. Business people welcomed the idea of laissez-faire. Wow. Adam Smith had theorized in The Wealth of Nations that productivity could be improved with the division of labor. Critics of laissez-faire, such as Jeremy Bentham in England and Friedrich List in Germany, argued that the state should take action to manage the economy and to address social problems. In France, the Count of Saint-Simon and Auguste Comte developed a philosophy called positivism, which argued the scientific method could solve social as well as technical problems. Karl Marx, guys, father of socialism. Marx developed a systematic framework for the analysis of human history, and along with Friedrich Engels, formulated the most powerful and influential critique of industrial capitalism in the Communist Manifesto, in which they argued the political organization and mobilization of the industrial working class. And this was published by the two of them in 1848. Marx had earned a doctoral degree in philosophy, and he believed that history was driven by changes in modes of production. Marx took the idea of the dialect from the level of intellect to the level of society. He recognized that capitalism led to cycles of economic prosperity, alternating with crashes that closed factories and lowered wages. Marx believed that capitalism was the underlying cause behind Europe's new imperialism. And Marx's socialist ideals challenged the idea of nationalism. He attempted to unite the proletariat, which failed. That would be the working class, though his ideas did continue to gain popularity. Karl Marx is often called the father of socialism, even though his book is the Communist Manifesto. A lot of his ideas later were used in communism, but history remembers him as the father of socialism, just so you know. All right, protests and reforms. Told you we'd come back to the Luddites. Workers initially responded to the harsh working conditions by changing jobs frequently, not reporting for work, doing poor quality work when not closely watched, and engaging in riots or strikes. Workers gradually moved beyond the stage of individual and organized resistance to create organizations for collective action, benevolent societies, and trade unions. The Luddites were formed in 1811 to protest unemployment caused by the Industrial Revolution. They used sabotage and violence, and in 1813, the British government crushed the movement. They would actually go into factories and destroy the machinery because they were being without a job. The Chartists grew out of the misery of workers and dissatisfaction with the British Parliament. The Reform Act of 1832 did not ensure the rights of workers or popular sovereignty. The Poor Law of 1834 forced unemployed people into workhouses. The Chartists demanded 6 reforms: manhood suffrage or universal suffrage for men, secret ballot, pay for members of parliament, abolition of property requirements for members of parliament, equal electoral districts, and annual elections. Trade unionists believed the government should be abolished and that all political and social decisions should be made by workers within trade unions. Socialists wanted representative democracies, universal male suffrage, and public ownership of the means of production. Governments manage the economy, and the people elect the governments, so they would eliminate poverty, equalize wealth levels, and promote social welfare. Communists wanted no capital or governments, no private ownership, all capital was held in common, all economic and political decisions were made by the workers in a democratic manner. Mass movements persuaded the British government to investigate the abuses of industrial life and to offer legislation that included the Factory Act of 1833, the Mines Act of 1842, and the repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846. In Europe, the revolutions of 1848 reveal widespread discontent, but European governments did not seek reform through accommodation. All right, we're going to wrap up in just a minute. We've got a couple more slides, and then we are finished with the Industrial Revolution. So moving on, the limits of industrialization outside of the Western world. In Egypt, there are multiple reforms happening. Egypt was taken over by Muhammad Ali in the early 19th century. Ali undertook a program of industrialization that was funded by the export of wheat and cotton and protected by high tariffs on imported goods. Ali was an Ottoman military commander who recognized that he needed money to keep up with the European powers. Muhammad Ali was an Ottoman Albanian commander in the Ottoman army, and he rose to the rank of Pasha and became a wali, or a governor, and then a self-declared Khedive, or viceroy of Egypt and Sudan, with the Ottomans' temporary approval. He's regarded as the founder of modern Egypt because of the dramatic reforms in the military, economic, and cultural spheres that he instituted. He also ruled Levantine territories outside of Egypt. The dynasty that he established would rule Egypt and Sudan until the Egyptian Revolution of 1852. The prospect of a powerful Egypt posed a threat to the British, and in 1839, Britain forced Muhammad Ali to eliminate all import duties. Without tariff protection, Egypt's industries could not compete with cheap British products. Egypt became an economic dependency of Britain. In both Egypt and the slave-owning southern U.S., the laborers who worked in the cotton fields saw little benefit from the industrialization of cotton. Industrialization also linked the globe via other products, such as palm oil from West Africa, which was used in European machinery. In India, which had once been the world's largest producer and exporter of cotton textiles, had trouble competing with the cheap machine-made British textiles, and this actually forced Indian spinners and hand weavers out of work. Most became landless peasants, and India became an exporter of raw materials and an importer of British industrial goods. Britain's control of India led to an increase in the exportation of raw cotton from India, and raw cotton was also imported to Britain from Egypt. Railroads, coal mining, and telegraph lines were introduced to India in the mid-19th century. Some Indian entrepreneurs were able to establish their own textile mills, but overall, India's industrialization proceeded at a very slow pace because the British administration did nothing to encourage Indian industry. And just some things you can see are some of the examples of the beautiful cotton textiles that were made in India. In China, a conservative elite and a growing population of peasants were concerned mainly with agriculture, with the result that the government did not see any need to subsidize or promote technological innovations or transfers. New military technologies, especially naval ones, changed the balance of power between Europe and China, allowing Britain to defeat the Chinese quickly and easily, especially when we get into the Opium Wars. We'll talk more about how they were able to do that. Industrialization was the most important change since the development of agriculture, with increased mechanical technology driving increased production of goods such as iron, cotton, lower prices, and faster transportation. The industrial age caused environmental problems, of course, as well as increased the stratification of society, with a new and growing middle class, but also major gaps between the upper and middle class and the middle and lower class. It generated concern for children as they were working in factories, and new philosophies related to the industrial age, such as Adam Smith, Jeremy Bentham, and Karl Marx. A small number of industrialized nations grew even more powerful, while others were left in further political and economic dependency because of these new industrialized nations. So thank you for listening, guys. If you have any questions, shoot me an email. Otherwise, have a good one. Cheers.